Hello all, my name is Connor and I am an educator here at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. Thank you for coming to Eastern State's Facebook page to listen to our discussion on the three major investigations in Eastern State's history. Last week, we examined Eastern State's first public scandal and investigation in 1834, and today we are jumping ahead 63 years to discuss the investigation of 1897. If you hadn't had a chance to see last week's video, I definitely recommend it, but this video can be watched on its own. At the heart of this investigation is a thorough and public examination of Eastern State's outdated separate system philosophy and the administration of Warden Michael J. Cassidy, Eastern State's first quote-unquote career warden, who's photographed on the left here. We will be looking at the major players involved in the investigation, such as family members of the subjects of the investigation, incarcerated individuals who served as witnesses, Judge James G. Gordon, who's pictured here on the right, and prison officials who tried to defend prison practices and methodologies. We will also be drawing contemporary connections to investigations of the impacts of solitary confinement on the mental health of those incarcerated in America. Throughout this presentation, we will be thinking about these two questions. Should solitary confinement be used in the US prison system today? And what should happen when a person is incarcerated and has a mental health illness? Before we go any further, please note that the content and language of today's discussion is sensitive and potentially upsetting as it relates to punishment and mistreatment of incarcerated people. We will also be discussing historic sources that use offensive and outdated language describing mental illnesses. In last week's video on the 1834 investigation, we discussed how a joint committee formed in the Pennsylvania legislature to bring 5 charges against the prison and its first warden, Warden Samuel R. Wood, after allegations of corruption and cruelty were raised by prison employees. We focused primarily on the third charge of cruel and unusual punishment in the death of a prisoner named Matthias Macumsey, and how the committee ultimately acquitted Eastern State of all charges, giving the prison a clean bill of health with a few mild reprimands and suggestions for reform. Looking forward to the 1897 investigation, there are a lot of similarities between the two scandals, but what stuck out for me was how both investigations were ignited by people going outside of the prison system to try to address abuses. In the 1897 investigation we're discussing today, the aunt of a prisoner named Archibald White filled this role. According to by going to Judge James Gordon, asking for his assistance to help her sick and injured nephew. What Gordon found on his first visit to Eastern State would become the biggest threat to the prison's reputation in several decades. Throughout Eastern State's early history, people evaluating the prison's separate system were concerned about the effects of isolation on the well-being of those incarcerated. Although the prison's founding correctional system proposed that isolation could help rehabilitate people and facilitate their re-entry back into society, staunch critics deemed the system more damaging than rehabilitative. Eastern State did not officially end the separate system until 1913. However, through much of the late 1800s, overcrowding became a huge problem, and by the 1870s, almost half of the prison population was sharing cells, working together, and beginning to exercise communally. The period during the 1880s and 1890s, overseen by longtime warden Michael Cassidy, marked an institutional transition. In Warden Cassidy's personal writings and prison conference testimonies, he began referring to the system he oversaw not as one of solitary confinement, but of individual treatment. Nevertheless, Cassidy's defense of the separate system and his new transitional system came under much scrutiny, specifically relating to its impacts on the mental health of prisoners. While Cassidy thought his new individual treatment system would be the model for prison reform, his administration was seemingly constantly battling outside criticism by the 1890s. One notable story that pops up is the report of John Clark, number 6257, a prisoner who was allegedly strapped in a coffin-like wooden box as a punishment in 1892. News of this incident spread across the region. In an article from the Philadelphia Inquirer on October 8th, 1892, Warden Cassidy, when he was asked about the incident, gave a non-committal answer and did not issue a denial, and he just simply said, "There's nothing to it." He instead described that John Clark came to Eastern State from the court and began to act badly a week after his admission. He is vile in his language and exceedingly filthy in his habits. Cassidy continued to say, "The insane are as well cared for here as they are in any lunatic asylum in the state. They could not be under better conditions." It's striking to read this article from 1892 because by the time we get to 1897, Warden Cassidy espoused much of the same beliefs. Clark was released from Eastern State when his sentence ended on May 22nd, 1893. In the fall of 1896, the aunt of an incarcerated man named Archibald White, number A8590, who was sentenced to 1 year for larceny, came to the office of a prominent jurist, Judge John Gordon. She begged him to help her nephew be transferred from Eastern State Penitentiary, saying that he is sick and dying, that he was insane, that his nose had been broken by the brutality of a keeper. Unfortunately, we do not know her name, nor do we have any images of Archibald White. However, this plea to Gordon helped instigate Gordon's inquiry into the treatment of prisoners at Eastern State and shaped Gordon as one of the biggest opponents to Warden Cassidy's administration. Judge Gordon was born in Philadelphia on November 11th, 1855 to Irish immigrants. He was a lawyer in private practice until his election to the state Senate in 1881, and he served until 1884. After his time in the Senate, he was appointed a judge of the Court of Common Pleas. Gordon's first Eastern State visit was in November of 1896 and began as an informal court inquiry. His intention was to meet White and assess his condition, and he was appalled with what he saw. "I went down and I found lying upon his cell floor in an absolutely empty cell an emaciated man, filthy in his person, filthy in all his surroundings, unable to rise, who, when spoken to by me, raised his head up, but could not get upon his feet. Mr. Cassidy dominatingly commanded him to rise, but it was futile. He could not. I requested an overseer to go in and lift him. He was lifted up on his feet and brought out to me into the corridor. For 20 minutes, I strove to get that man to speak. He uttered not a word. He wouldn't. Mr. Cassidy told him to speak, that he could if he wanted to, that he knew how to behave, and that he was doing this purposefully. Not one word would he utter. Across his nose was a great gash that had been recently stitched, deep and long. I asked Mr. Cassidy to withdraw, and alone I sought to get this man to speak. When Judge Gordon confronted Warden Cassidy on White's condition, Cassidy replied, no, he is malingering. He is not insane. Malingering basically means feigning or faking an illness. This language reveals how Cassidy and other prison officials at Eastern State used to describe people with mental illnesses. In December of 1896, Judge Gordon convened a session in the Court of Common Pleas to determine whether Archibald White should be removed from Eastern State to a state hospital and to discover systematic problems within Warden Cassidy's administration. He had assembled a committee of physicians and a former judge to visit Eastern State to decide if wrongdoing had occurred. During the hearing, Gordon asked those testifying about how many people with mental illnesses were incarcerated at Eastern State. The prison physician, Dr. John Bacon, responded that there are 10 or 12 persons in the penitentiary whose insanity cannot be doubted. However, during the testimony of Assistant District Attorney Thomas W. Barlow, Barlow admitted that the statement made by the inspectors of the penitentiary through their physicians that but 10 or 12 convicts were insane was false, and that there could be up to 100 people who are insane incarcerated at Eastern State. In addition to suppressing information, the prison was also accused of inhumane treatment. Dr. William S. Janney testified, the manner of treating the insane there was, to say the least, in my judgment, inhumane. It is a disgrace to an intelligent community that they take their insane and lock them up in a small, foul, dirty cells. They are constantly surrounded by an impure atmosphere. He additionally told Gordon that when the toilets were flushed twice a day, the fecal matter or the stench came up to the openings into each cell and permeated each cell. In fact, the whole building was permeated. At the conclusion of the hearing, Judge Gordon forced Eastern State to transfer Archibald White to Norristown State Hospital, an asylum, but added the disposition of the case of this one prisoner is of trifling moment compared with the matters disclosed by this investigation. This hearing marked just the beginning of Gordon's efforts to reveal Eastern State's inhumane treatment of people within its walls. He stated, "I regard myself as now in official possession of information that the law has been violated by the detention of insane persons in that prison. I intend to call such attention to the general subject, both by the legislature and by other courts, that something may be done to put Pennsylvania in the line of civilization and humanity in the treatment of its criminal insane." Judge Gordon was ready to take the investigation up to the state level. In the spring of 1897, a legislative committee was formed to investigate malpractice at Eastern State under Warden Cassidy's watch. While we currently do not have the written report of the investigation available to us, we can assume that because Judge Gordon was spearheading the investigation into Eastern State, that the legislative committee was well aware of Gordon's initial 1896 hearing. He was also present with the legislative committee when they went to visit the prison for themselves. Gordon testified on the fourth day of the hearings about his beliefs about the prison's mistreatment of prisoners, charging Eastern State with falsehood in their official reports, with conscious and deliberate misstatements before this committee under oath. I wish to charge them with cruelty and inhumanity in the discharge of their duties, with neglect, with incompetence. I wish to charge them with secreting evidence, with fabricating evidence. I wish to charge them with intimidating witnesses. I want to present the proof seriatim against every one of them, and I am glad that they are all here. In citing specific instances of physical abuse suffered by prisoners, he once again called the committee's attention to Archibald White. By this time, White had been transferred to Norristown State Hospital, and according to Judge Gordon, White gained nearly 50 pounds in 6 months. And he said, "When I took him out of here, he couldn't walk without assistance. He could not arise from a chair. He can scarcely do it now. This man has not opened his mouth for 6 months." Warden Cassidy testified. He provided curiously circuitous and misleading responses about the use of solitary confinement. When asked if people were being put in solitary confinement, Cassidy replied, "No, there was never such a thing here." When people asked what the least number of people he put in a cell, he replied, 1, but clarified that that is not solitary confinement. An occupant of a cell has communication with the people who come to the prison, except convicts. When asked if he put anyone in padded cells, he replied, "No. Sometimes we remove the furniture from a cell, leave it entirely bare, and leave the man in it. That is one method of punishment." These contradictory responses about solitary confinement and punishment not only revealed inconsistencies in the warden's testimony, but also inconsistencies in the larger committee proceedings. In addition to Judge Gordon and prison officials, 22 incarcerated people were chosen at random and brought to testify in front of the committee. Although Chairman Augustus Seafort of the committee promised each person immunity for the delivery of their testimony, the safety of prisoners who testified was called into question because prisoners, for the most part, did not criticize the institution. In the Eastern State Historic Structures Report, historian Leslie Patrick Stamp highlights the particular testimony of a prisoner, number 6583, one of 2 female prisoners to testify. Patrick Stamp states that the prisoner seems to have had difficulty remaining coherent during her testimony, and that a reporter at one point in the inquiry noted that she talked in a rapid and almost unintelligible way. Her sentences were disconnected and partly inaudible. This description suggests that even though this prisoner's testimony attempted to challenge the testimonies of others who identified prison officials' benevolence, the condition of the prisoner during her testimony might have impacted the content of her statements. This detail raises many questions about the experience and risks of being incarcerated and testifying against a prison institution, such as what retribution could exist for someone when they return to confinement if they spoke poorly of their prison. According to Leslie Patrick Stamp, prisoners were probably aware of the repercussions of testifying during this investigation. She points to the fact that Gordon testified before prisoners, and word would have traveled fast throughout the prison about his allegations, possibly shaping what people could and could not say. Secondly, she identifies that prison officials were in the audience during their testimonies. And thirdly, she asserts that legislators' questions about the conditions were leading and crafted to receive positive responses. One person who was previously incarcerated in Eastern State, Henry Yost, did approach the committee about testifying his firsthand experiences with prison officials. However, committee chairman Seifert ignored the request, so Yost went public, compromising the integrity of the investigation and the chairman with his testimony. At this time, we do not know what Yost exactly said or the impact his informal testimony might have had. These assessments of prisoner testimonies reveal the power dynamics not only created by prison officials trying to defend prison practices, but also by the structures of the legislative body presiding over the investigation. Ultimately, the committee concluded its hearings by giving the prison management, once again, a clean bill of health, just like the 1834 investigation. But according to historian Negley Teeters, no person today could read the testimony without believing that severe beatings of inmates occurred, despite the fact that the warden justified such punishment in the name of discipline. Much of the details and findings of the 1897 investigation connect to examinations of today of solitary confinement's impact on mental health. A U.S. Department of Justice report compiled in 2006 estimated that more than half of all people in prison or jail in the United States have a mental illness. In 2013, the Disability Rights Network of Pennsylvania filed a lawsuit alleging that a third of the 2,300 people imprisoned in solitary confinement just in Pennsylvania had serious mental illnesses. Similarly, a 2015 article from the New York Times highlights an ongoing lawsuit over long-term solitary confinement at Pelican Bay State Prison in California. This suit was filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of people who had spent more than 10 years in solitary confinement, claiming that this isolation violated their Eighth Amendment rights to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. A psychologist, Dr. Craig Haney, prepared several reports for the case, interviewing 56 prisoners who had spent 10 to 28 years in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit. Among the people in isolation that Dr. Haney interviewed, 73% reported chronic depression. Additionally, according to this article, studies have found that suicides among people in solitary confinement account for 50% of all prison suicides. Here at Eastern State, we have an art installation entitled Photo Requests from Solitary that displays requests for images from people currently in long-term solitary confinement. A feature of the installation are accounts from people currently and formerly imprisoned in solitary confinement. Here, a person named Anthony, who spent 5 years in solitary, reflects, "I didn't know the effect that solitary had on me until I left there. Communicating with people, interacting with people, even talking on the phone. I'm nervous and jumpy when I'm around other people. I can't seem to get used to it." The installation states that under international human rights standards, 15 days or more in solitary confinement is a cruel, inhuman, or degrading punishment, and that it is torture. Currently in the United States, an estimated 80,000 people in state and federal prisons are held in 23-hour-a-day solitary confinement. So, going back to the questions we were thinking about at the beginning of the presentation, do you think solitary confinement should be used in the US prison system? Why or why not? And what should happen when a person is incarcerated and has a mental health illness? Thank you so much for stopping by our Facebook page today and learning about the 1897 investigation. Stay tuned next week for our final installment discussing the 1923 investigation.